Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there lived a queen whose greatest wish was to have a child. One winter's day, as snowflakes drifted gently from the sky, the queen sat at her window, sewing and gazing at the world cloaked in white. As she pricked her finger, 3 drops of crimson blood fell onto the snow-covered windowsill. Inspired by the beauty before her, she whispered, "If only I could have a child with skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony." Not long after, the queen's wish was granted. She gave birth to a beautiful daughter and named her Snow White. Tragically, the queen did not live to see her daughter grow. The king, heartbroken but mindful of his responsibilities, soon remarried. The new queen was breathtakingly beautiful, but she was also vain and cruel, obsessed with being the fairest in the land. She possessed a magical mirror, and every day she would ask, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" "Malsits, alsi senior may." The mirror would always reply, "Ki. You, my queen, are the fairest of them all." Satisfied, the queen would go about her day, secure in her beauty. As years passed, Snow White blossomed into a young woman. Her skin glowed like fresh snow, her lips rivaled the color of the reddest roses, and her hair was as dark as a raven's wing. Word of her beauty spread throughout the kingdom, and soon the queen's mirror gave a different answer. "My queen, you are fair, it is true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." Enraged and consumed by jealousy, the queen could not bear the thought of being second to anyone. She summoned a huntsman, commanding him to take Snow White deep into the forest and to never let her return. To prove his loyalty, she demanded that he bring back Snow White's heart. Torn between his duty and his conscience, the huntsman led Snow White into the woods. But when the time came, he could not harm the innocent girl. He begged her to flee and never return to the castle, warning her of the queen's deadly envy. Snow White ran deeper into the forest, her heart pounding with fear and sadness. Through tangled branches and thick undergrowth, Snow White wandered until she stumbled upon a quaint little cottage. Inside, everything was neat and tidy, though clearly sized for much smaller occupants. Exhausted, Snow White lay across several tiny beds and fell into a deep sleep. As night fell, the true owners of the cottage returned home. They were 7 dwarfs who spent their days mining precious gems from the mountains. When they entered and saw Snow White sleeping peacefully, they were at first startled, but soon enchanted by her innocence and beauty. When she awoke, Snow White told them her story, and the dwarfs, moved by her plight, offered her shelter and protection in exchange for help with their chores. Grateful and relieved, Snow White accepted, promising to keep their home clean and cook delicious meals. Days turned into weeks, and Snow White found happiness among her new friends. The dwarfs adored her, and she grew to love each one for their unique personalities: grumpy, cheerful, bashful, and all the rest. But danger still lurked in the kingdom. When the queen learned from her mirror that Snow White was still alive, her jealousy flared hotter than ever. Disguising herself as an old peddler woman, she devised a plan to rid herself of Snow White once and for all. One day, while the dwarfs were away in the mines, the disguised queen arrived at the cottage door, offering Snow White a beautifully laced bodice as a gift. Trusting and unaware, Snow White allowed the old woman to help her try it on, but the queen laced it so tightly that Snow White collapsed, unable to breathe. Satisfied, the queen hurried away, believing her rival defeated. When the dwarfs returned, they quickly loosened the bodice, and Snow White revived. But the queen was relentless. Upon hearing from her mirror that Snow White still lived, she returned to the cottage in another disguise, this time with a poisoned comb. Convincing Snow White to let her style her hair, the queen drove the poisoned comb into her scalp. Once again, Snow White fell, and once again, the dwarfs rescued her, removing the comb and bringing her back to life. Furious and desperate, the queen crafted her most wicked plan yet. She conjured a shining, rosy red apple, one half laced with a deadly poison, the other harmless. Disguised as a kindly grandmother, she tempted Snow White to taste the fruit. Despite her friends' warnings and her own hesitation, Snow White's innocence prevailed. She took a bite of the poisoned half, and with a sigh, fell to the ground, lifeless. The dwarfs returned to find their beloved friend cold and still. Overcome with grief, they could not bear to bury her. Instead, they built a glass coffin, placing Snow White inside so her beauty would be preserved forever. Day and night they kept vigil, mourning the gentle soul who had brought such joy to their lives. Seasons changed, and word of Snow White's beauty spread far and wide. One day, a prince traveling through the forest saw the glass coffin and was instantly captivated by the sight of Snow White. Struck by love, he begged the dwarfs to let him take her to his palace, promising to honor her memory forever. As the prince's servants lifted the coffin, they stumbled, and the piece of poisoned apple lodged in Snow White's throat was dislodged. She gasped, drew breath, and slowly opened her eyes. The dwarfs, the prince, and all who witnessed it rejoiced, for Snow White was alive once more. Grateful to her friends and touched by the prince's devotion, Snow White agreed to accompany him to his kingdom. A grand wedding was held, and people from every corner of the land came to celebrate the union of the fair maiden and her prince. The evil queen, upon learning of Snow White's survival and happiness, was driven mad by rage and jealousy, never to trouble her again. And so, Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after, surrounded by friends, love, and the promise of a future free from darkness. The story of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs became a legend, a timeless reminder that kindness and innocence will always triumph over hatred and envy. And in the hearts of all who heard her tale, Snow White's beauty and goodness endured forever.